The top five most controversial United States elections in history. The 1800 election was held right at the start of American history, as it was only the second contested election following the 1796 election, seeing John Adams beat Thomas Jefferson. Interestingly, it would be those two men against each other once again. Adams was a Federalist. In fact, he was honestly the face of the Federalist Party. Well, maybe after Alexander Hamilton. And Thomas Jefferson, the inarguable leader of the Democratic Republican Party, a party which succeeded the Anti Federalist Party. This was held before the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, finalizing the rules for vice presidents and running mates. So, all candidates ran against each other regardless of party. This also made the previous election in 1796 very controversial, as the failure of John Adams' Federalist electors to vote for his de facto running mate, Charles Pinckney, gave the vice presidency to his rival, Thomas Jefferson. This election saw some of the most controversial, politically incorrect, out of date stuff thrown from both sides of the political aisle. Jefferson had attacked Adams by claiming he was a hideous hermaphroditical character which has neither the force or firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman, which was quickly responded to by the Adams campaign, claiming Jefferson was a mean spirited, low lived fellow, the son of a half breed Indian squaw sired by a Virginia mulatto father. Now, if those insults weren't horrible enough, I'd like you to imagine this coming from your friend. Yep, that's right. Adams and Jefferson were best friends before this campaign. And the last one, I'd assume, as well. Making these insults just hurt more. Yes, by the way, I am aware that these candidates didn't actually campaign so much in the earlier days, and it was more the supporters claiming these things, but still. The election ended in early December with Jefferson winning. Well, he at least beat Adams. Like I said, there was no running mate back in those days, just whoever got the second most electoral votes. Jefferson and Burr tied on electoral votes. Congress stepped in and decided the election, giving it to Thomas Jefferson on February the 17th, 1801, after 36 ballots. That's how close America got to having Aaron Burr as their president. The 1960 election was held at a time of relative stability at home. The at home is doing some heavy lifting, as this was at the heart of the Cold War. However, looking back at the past few decades, under Republican Dwight Eisenhower, the 1950s didn't have major instability and war like the 40s, nor a Great Depression like the 30s. The general consensus was that the Republicans had done a good job. Such a good job that the Republicans decided to nominate Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, as the presidential nominee in 1960. At this time, Nixon was very popular, so don't get the wrong idea. Despite Nixon being only 47 and in any election would be the young candidate, he was the old candidate, as the Democrats nominated 43-year-old John F. Kennedy, affectionately nicknamed Jack Kennedy. Kennedy had nominated Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson as his running mate. Despite Johnson feeling humiliated and belittled by this appointment, he accepted it. Nixon had nominated Henry Cabot Lodge as his running mate. The controversy with its selection doesn't stem from the actual campaign, as this election saw a lot of companionship between both Kennedy and Nixon. The controversy stems from the results. There was widespread allegations of voting fraud, especially in Texas, where Kennedy's running mate, Lyndon B. Johnson, was senator, and Illinois, home of Mayor Richard J. Daley's powerful Chicago political machine. The two states were important because if Nixon had won both of them, he would have been elected president with 270 electoral votes, one more than the 269 needed to win the election. Republican senators such as Everett Dirksen and Barry Goldwater claimed vote fraud played a role in the election. and that Nixon actually won the national popular vote. Earl Mazo, a journalist who was Nixon's biographer, made accusations of voter fraud. Nixon's campaign staff urged him to preserve recounts and challenge the validity of Kennedy's victory in several states, especially Illinois, Missouri, and New Jersey, where large majorities in Catholic precincts handed Kennedy the election. However, Nixon gave a speech 3 days after the election stating that he would not contest the election. However, to this day, the 1960 election is still contested, with many believing that Nixon had truly won the election. However, ultimately, it doesn't really matter, as Nixon had his time to shine in 1968 in another pretty controversial election. The 1824 presidential election was held at a pretty interesting time in American history. This was held right at the end of the era of good feelings, nicknamed such because by this time the Federalist Party had completely died out and the Democratic Republican Party was ruling as a sort of one party state. Of course, however, people were bound to disagree with the Democratic Republicans, and at the 1820 election, with only incumbent President James Monroe as a candidate, he only got 78% of the popular vote, showing 22% of Americans were against him. But, anyways, back to 1824. Monroe promised not to run for a third term, stepping aside for the de facto nominee to be John Quincy Adams. Adams was the son of President John Adams, and Quincy Adams had also served in the Democratic Republican cabinets of Madison and Monroe. Under Monroe, he was the Secretary of State, a profession which every president since the turn of the century had served in. However, some people didn't like Adams' elitism. These were the types of people who flocked over to Andrew Jackson. Jackson's supporters were nicknamed Democrats, as they were in favor of a real democracy. You see, by 1824, only rich white property owning men could vote in elections. The fact that that took me 8 syllables is honestly quite a shame. But, anyways, by 1824, more and more laws were getting passed to expand suffrage to any white man. Jackson was far from rich and aristocratic, as he grew up poor and orphaned, with no direct family following his father's death before his birth and his mother and brother's death during the Revolution. Crucially, however, this election wouldn't be limited to just these two. Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, and later on founding the Whig Party, and William Crawford, formerly Secretary of War and Secretary of State for the Treasury, ran in this election. Most people believed it had to be either one of Adams or Jackson who would win the election. However, both Crawford and Clay put up a pretty good performance in the election, preventing either one of Adams or Jackson from winning an outright majority. This took the election to the House, where Henry Clay was Speaker. Oh, but don't worry, Clay had already been eliminated from participating in this second round, but he did use his influence to skew the results. You see, everyone agreed Crawford had not a chance, so nobody cared about him. But Clay absolutely hated Jackson, so he used his influence to give more votes to Adams. Adams won the election despite getting less popular votes and less electoral votes. To this day, Jackson is still praised as the outright winner of this election. But it's alright, as Jackson would get his shot with 2 full terms after beating Adams in 1828 and Clay in 1832. This election is possibly the most contested and talked about today, which shouldn't be a surprise to many, as it's not only the most recent election on this list, but most people are old enough to remember this election. It was held at such a peculiar time in history. America had just endured 8 straight years of unusual economic growth under Democrat Bill Clinton. However, Bill Clinton had had an affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky and then lied about it under oath. He was impeached, but it mostly failed due to the absolute popularity that Clinton had with the average American. So naturally, the Democrats nominated his popular Vice President, Al Gore, for president, and nominated Senator Joe Lieberman for vice president. The Republicans nominated the son of former President George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Dick Cheney for vice president. The election was very close, with both sides believing they had a genuine shot of winning. This election was initially called for Al Gore after Florida's 25 electoral votes went to the Democratic candidate. However, it was then put into the too close to call category, revoking Al Gore's status as president elect. It was then called for Bush, then Gore, and Bush one more time again. He was officially declared president elect, but Al Gore supporters weren't about to give up so easily. The returns show that Bush won Florida by such a close margin that state law required a recount. A month long series of legal battles led to the highly controversial 5-4 U.S. Supreme Court decision, Bush v. Gore, which ended the recount with Bush winning Florida by 537 votes, a margin of 0.009%. Others claim that Green Party candidate Ralph Nader played spoiler in Florida. However, post election analysis has found that over 2,000 votes for Gore were actually butterfly ballot misdirected to a candidate called Pat Buchanan, tipping Florida and the election to Bush, effectively meaning Al Gore was the correct winner of the 2000 election. Gore won the popular vote. The 1876 election was held at a particularly tricky time in American history. Following the conclusion of the American Civil War in 1865, Northern troops were sent to the South to protect the African Americans, who were at risk of murder and other negative things at the hands of the secessionists. Keep in mind, not all Southerners had wanted secession, nor were slave owners, but the vast majority were, making the life of an African American pretty horrible. This process was known as Reconstruction. Reconstruction was initially popular, well, in the North, anyways. However, by the end of Ulysses Grant's term in 1876, it was unpopular as your average Northerner wanted to move past the issue. Enter the election of 1876, held in early November, per usual. The Republicans, who had won every election since 1860, nominated Civil War hero and governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democrats, the popular party in the South, nominated New York Governor Samuel Tilden. As weird as it may seem that the party of the South would nominate a Northerner as their candidate, it's actually a pretty genius ploy to garner more votes in the North, a region who had not supported the Democrats since the days of Van Buren. Despite the Republicans' clear stranglehold over the general populace, having won each of the last four elections, at midnight on November 8, it looked set in stone that Samuel Tilden would win the election. 185 electoral votes were required for the victory in the election, where Tilden had 184. Four states were yet to declare their votes. These four states would end up being quite controversial. These states were Oregon, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. One thing you may notice is that three of these four states were in the South. You know, the region of the Democrats. And yes, not every single Southerner was a Democrat, but Republican votes were often suppressed by the Democrat majority, oftentimes showing a huge majority for the Democrats in southern states. It looked certain that Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina would vote Democrat, as all of the other southern states had. However, they showed a Republican victory. All four of the controversial states had. It looked fishy. The Democrats accused the Republicans of cheating in the election, something that doesn't sound impossible when you realize 101% of all eligible voters voted in South Carolina. It got so heated between the two sides that nobody legally knew who won for a while. Congress decided to create a 15-man electoral commission made out of 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and an independent named David Davis. It's often been said that no one but Davis truly knew which candidate he preferred. The Democrats expected him to side with them as they had supported him previously. However, they miscalculated, as Davis was replaced by Republican Joseph Bradley, who sided with them, awarding Rutherford Hayes all 20 disputed votes and effectively the presidency. However, one of the main reasons as to why the Democrats eventually decided to accept the ruling was the Compromise of 1877. The Compromise of 1877 was a compromise promising to gift the Republicans the presidency in exchange for Reconstruction to end, which of course was not a popular thing for Southern Democrats. both parties accepted. To this day, the 1877 election is still argued about in online chambers, claiming Hayes to be an illegitimate president and that Tilden had truly won the presidency. But will we ever know? Tilden's Democrats won the popular vote. So there you have it, the top five most controversial United States presidential elections, in my opinion. If you disagree with me, I'd like to know what you think the top five most controversial elections are. If you did enjoy this video, I highly suggest you to subscribe to the channel because 93% of you guys are not subscribed. Let's try and lower that number a tad bit. Thank you for watching.